Okay, welcome back to Introductory Sociology. Hopefully you all had a good spring break. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some housekeeping matters, where we're at and where we're going. Today we're going to talk about education. And then next class we're going to have the exam review, so I would recommend that you record that if it helps you. Also, I'm going to have the director of the Curry County Detention Center come to our class on Thursday and talk. He emailed me a few weeks ago. They're interested in hiring CCC students, either part-time or full-time, and if it's part-time, they totally work around your class schedule. I was just glancing at it, and apparently part-time position is, they pay from $13.83 to $17.29. I'm not sure how they plug you in, but that's a range of what they would what they pay. So if you're interested, we're going to probably have him talk for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll get into the exam review. Now, the rough drafts of your next paper, I believe, are due. Does anyone have a syllabus to quickly check it? Is it Thursday they're due?
I thought they were due today.
Or are they due today? Oh, they're due tonight. Okay, so then they're due tonight at midnight via email. And as usual, if you don't receive acknowledgement from me that I got it, then make sure you send it again, because I'm not going to probably reply at midnight, but the next morning I'll come in and I'll say, hey, thanks, I got your rough draft, and same as usual. It'll take me maybe 4 or 5 days, and I'll go through and make some comments and editorial revisions on your rough drafts. Now, also, if you haven't picked up a study guide, there's a few there. What you want to do is get that study guide, and before this exam would be next week, you want to make sure you've gone through it and you understand the answers to the questions. Hi, you can sign in and grab a study guide. So, any questions about any of that? And just to clarify, for your second paper, it obviously has to be something different than what you previously wrote on. And if you're going to write about something that isn't one of the possible 10 topics, then you're going to need previous approval for me. But in other words, submit a brief paragraph about what you want to write about, and I'll let you know if that's acceptable. But most people are going to just, and by the way, some people just don't do the papers, not only in this class, but in times past. And keep in mind, if you don't do both of the papers, you're already down 30%, so it makes it hard to pass the class. So you want to do something. I mean, it's better to try to do at least something than just to ignore it and not submit anything at all. All right. Oh, and another side note, for some reason I have attendance being listed during spring break. You can ignore that. I'm just not going to put anything in there. Obviously, you don't lose or gain points in spring break. All right, so we're going to talk about the U.S. educational system today. And of course, as with all topics, you could have a class in this itself, so it'll be a general overview. Now, education involves transmitting some kind of knowledge. The content has changed throughout our history as a nation. Early on, formal schooling was rare. The family taught children what they needed to know, how to farm, cultural norms, social values, etc. And early on in the American educational system, even at that point, it was a lot more vocational. Women would learn how to sew, men would learn how to perform mechanical tasks and so forth. Now, the Founding Fathers thought education was important for democracy, and even today there's evidence that it in fact is. There's a book by Sidney Almond and Gabriel Verba. It's called A Civic Culture, and in this book he points out that countries that are not so stable, that are prone to revolution, riots, etc., it seems to be correlated with a lack of literacy, a lack of education. So when the public is literate and able to read and write, you tend to have a more stable country. So it's good for national stability. Business leaders favored it because we need to have marketable skills, just for example, basic reading and arithmetic. There was once a Motorola company that They wanted to create a plant in Chicago, and they couldn't find enough qualified applicants to pass the basic literacy test and, arithmetic and so forth. And so they had to move to Elgin, which is a suburb or farther out. So it's important. There was also pressure from unions because in the 1920s, before child labor laws, a lot of times children were working pretty much in adult jobs and working very cheaply. And so unions didn't like that idea. And this came together to form the American educational system that initially focused on character as well. There's less of that today because it kind of ties in or connects to religion, and due to the constitutional restrictions on teaching or promoting a particular religion, we have less of that today. So, early schools spent time preparing students to work, and then there's actually a debate nowadays in universities. Historically, in universities, we've had a liberal education. That means no matter what you major in, you have to take a bunch of general classes. So let's say you're an engineering or computer science major, you're going to have to take classes like art appreciation and so forth. And then there's the debate, though, is should you really have to? I mean, let's say you're a nursing major, so you're more about science, human anatomy and stuff. Should you still have to take social science classes to get your degree? I mean, well, currently you do, but it's a debatable. I mean, for accreditation purposes, you do. So early schools spent time teaching kids how to do a particular task. We soon saw age-graded classrooms come to exist, and you all are too young to remember this, but when I was in the first grade or second grade, it was very common to have classes like first, second, and third grade all taught by one teacher in the same room. And if you went back far enough, anyone seen the show Little House on the Prairie? Well, in that show, it was a log cabin type of school, and they all were in the same class, even the high school students. I don't know, did any of you go to, say, when you were in first grade, it was first and second combined, or by this time it should have been split. So we saw age-graded classrooms coming to exist. And schools have been similar throughout history, but there's been some debate about what their emphasis should be. There's also been debate about teacher certification. I'll tell you a little story here. Back when I was in the university at Albany, I didn't know directly about this, but I was told there was a math professor there who had a PhD, and he had actually been voted the best professor on campus. And then he retired. So he was like, I don't know, 65 or 70. And there was an inner city school in Albany, New York, that didn't have a math teacher. They couldn't hire one. And so he said, I'll just volunteer to teach the high school math for free. And then the unions opposed it. They said, you're not certified. You don't have a teacher certification, so they wouldn't let him do it, even though he was probably more qualified than a lot because he had a doctorate degree and an excellent record of teaching. Some states are pulling, North Carolina, for example, is loosening up on the restrictions about certification. I mean, if you have a degree, they're willing to consider you. 1960s, there was the open classroom approach, where the curriculum to some extent was based on democratic values. In other words, the students would provide their input about what they'd want to learn, and the class content would be geared toward that. Kind of reminds me, this is silly, but I remember we had a substitute teacher in choir, and it was obvious this was a choir classroom because there was a piano, and so the substitute teacher came in and said, what class is this? Nobody told me. And so then some smart aleck said it's sex education. So he, for an hour, gave us a lecture on whatever, So he said, "Are you sure this is a health class?" Plus, there's like 100 people in there too, so it's obviously a choir. But anyway, so the back to basic movement is another trend. Here, the teachers focus on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and they want to make sure that people have competency in these areas. Because if you went back I'm going to say prior to 1987, we had this concept of social promotions. That is, if you showed up and smiled, I mean, you wouldn't be guaranteed a good grade, but you'd pass. I mean, when I was in high school, I was a pretty lazy student. I just showed up. I mean, if I didn't get something done in class, I just didn't turn it in. But now we're actually failing students, holding them back. We require testing to make sure that they're competent. I mean, Dexter Manley, a former professional football player in the early 80s, testified before Congress that he was illiterate. How is it that you get a high school and a university degree when you can't read or write? How do you think he got a university degree from a major university when he couldn't read or write?
Wanted him to play football.
They wanted him to play football, so they pretty much passed him. And now there was pressure, a lot of pressure for that to happen. Now less so. Today, though, compared to the rest of the world, we're pretty well behind in comparing to other first world countries. And one of the reasons for that is our school year is just a lot shorter. In Japan, I'm forgetting the exact, I mean, they don't have, their summer vacation is like a week or 10 days, and they also go to school on Saturdays. This is true in Australia, Germany. They just have a longer school year. Now, today, many American children, if you gave them a map, wouldn't be able to say where Washington, D.C. is, or label the countries of South America. Students from other countries seem to be better, even in punctuation. Like, for instance, the sentence, "My nickname is Scott." Where would the period go? Would it go right after the T or after the in parentheses? After the T, right. And so, yeah, there's a lot of deficiencies that are going on. Now, the Back to Basic plan in '87, when I graduated high school, is that children should begin school ready to read, know their alphabet. Programs like Head Start try to emphasize this. The national high school graduation rate would be at least 90%. Part of the problem, though, is the testing. In order to graduate high school in all states, you have to pass a test. I think now, what is it, PARC in high school? It used to be something different. But you have to pass this. In the Clovis Christian schools, it's the same thing. You have to pass a test.
Well, no, because since it's private school,
You don't have to take that. Yeah. So competence will be shown in core subjects. So there will be standardized testing, typically 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade. When you were in high school, were these tests administered to you? Was it, if you recall? Did you? Well, not the one to graduate, but the ones that are just done to see what the schools, how the students in the school on the average are doing.
In California, it was sophomore year.
Mm-hmm.
Mine was my freshman year and then my senior
Yeah,
year.
and so what they'll do is you can get put on the quote naughty list. Basically, the No Child Left Behind Act. If a school has a high rate of students who don't test well enough, then they can potentially get in trouble with the. In fact, they don't do this anymore. They used to require it on their websites to list if they were in compliance with the No Child Left Behind Act, and there was only 2 schools in this district who were in full compliance, and one was Zia, and anyone guess what the other one? Mesa. Zia and Mesa. Now, of course, blaming the schools, you can take that can be taken too far. If the students at Mesa Elementary are doing well, is that necessarily all the teachers? Do you attribute that to the teachers completely?
No.
Why would the students at Mesa do better than the ones at Lockwood?
Because it's just the child or the kid.
Right. It's sometimes the wealth, the parents. I mean, in order to go to school in Mesa, you have to live in that school boundary. And so the homes tend to be a bit more expensive, and the parents perhaps are a bit more involved. So you have these tests, and I'll talk about an example of potentially cultural bias in them, but American students would be the best educated in the world in math and science. That's a goal, but it's hard to achieve, as I've said, with our shortened school year, and also, compared to the rest of the world. And interestingly enough, many students who come from a foreign country and go to school in the United States, go to university, they'll take math just to boost their GPA, the initial one, because it's something they've already done in high school. It's really, for them, it's high school stuff. Now, of course, one interesting thing on this AccuPlacer test, it's different at a larger university, but I'm thinking the figures are close to 60% don't test into Math 101. That is, have you all taken the AccuPlacer test? The funny thing is, if it's really short, you didn't do very well. I mean, if it's long, like my son got them all right, but it took him 3 hours. But then my daughter, her test was like 30 minutes, and they said, "You're done." So. But the point is, I think the question is, why is it that most, I don't want to say most, but probably at least half of students who got out of high school don't have the ability to take a regular math class? In fact, I was one of those. I had to take Math 99 before I could get into the regular one. Why do you think that is?
Because they're not paying attention.
Didn't pay attention in school?
They just have a
Learning problem? Yeah. I guess in my case, I just didn't see the need for it. I remember asking my math teacher, forgetting his name, but I said, what is the point of like this quadratic equation? Like, how is that ever going to help me in real life? And then he said, in your case, it probably won't help you, but the point is, it's free or something like that. And so I didn't understand what he meant by that until I got to college and had to pay cash for a remedial math class that didn't count for anything, and in order to get into the regular one. And then if I only had paid attention in high school, that wouldn't have happened. Now, all adults must be literate and possess the skills necessary for competition in a global economy. Illiteracy is a problem because a lot of people will hide it. They're embarrassed, ashamed, etc. But there are restaurants in Detroit, for example, that have picture menus because people aren't able to read the description. In fact, if you go to a typical jail, I used to take my students on field trips to county jails. And one of the questions I would ask them, the warden, is what % of the inmates here are not able to read or write? And it was always like 70%. I mean, they can read things like a stop sign, but they can't really read it. They just know it's stop because it's orange and octagon and the shape of it, but they just can't read, and these are adults. Or when asked to sign their name, they scribble because they can't write. Schools must be free of drugs and violence. We've had laws increasing the penalty when there's drug involvement in a school, when there's an arrest for that. And nowadays, it's been a while, but how often does the dog come to sniff for drugs when you were in school? I mean, not for you personally, but just generally a walk around. And it happened in Clovis like twice a year, I think, in the high school. You've never experienced to have like the police come in with a drug dog?
Yeah, funny thing is, in high school I went, everybody knew that the druggies were, but the teachers never really paid attention or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. The drug dog was always on campus, but it never.
Didn't find any.
Surprisingly, it never. Kids would always,
Yeah, didn't find any drugs. And schools are relatively safe compared to outside of the school. I mean, there's been a lot of talk and concern about school shootings, and they're horrible, but on the whole, a young person has a bigger chance of getting into a violent situation outside of school than in the school. And now we have zero tolerance policies. Like when I was in high school, sometimes it wasn't uncommon for there to be a fight, and then you got sent to the in-school suspension. But now what happens if you get in a fist fight?
Suspended from school and go home for 3 days.
Yeah, or possibly longer. The police are perhaps involved. So we're trying to crack down on drugs and violence. One of the interesting things, though, will be the effect of legalization of marijuana. It's legal on the West Coast and Colorado and other places. Will that make for an increase in possession and use in school? It's interesting. I don't know. When I was in high school, they often said it's easier to get marijuana than alcohol, because they ask for your ID when you buy alcohol, and I had no idea where to buy marijuana, but is that still true today? I mean, assuming that you wanted to go buy marijuana somewhere, and you were really wanted to, how long would it take you to get marijuana in today's climate? 10 minutes?
Yeah, I'm guessing probably pretty easy.
5 minutes? Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, and sad to say, as you pointed out, in some schools, the teachers and principals kind of turn an eye away from it. They've kind of more or less given up on it, on fighting it. Now, the goals are laudable, but there's some question as to whether we'll reach them anytime soon. Another trend is cooperative education, where students study in groups with teachers acting as guides. They're rewarded based on the quality of their group effort. Now, personally, though, I've tried experiments with that, and sometimes it works out okay. You get working in a group leads to greater knowledge and success, but most of the time, in my experience, you end up with a slacker. Like, I used to assign my sociology students into like a group of 3 or 4, and then they did a group presentation that involved research, and I always got the complaint that Susie's not helping, or Mike is lazy, and it led to hostilities. I don't know. Have you ever been assigned a group project and had to deal with one student that just didn't want to carry the weight? What do you do? Just say please? Yeah, but in Japan though, for example, in a math class, they'll sit out on a subject until everybody demonstrates competency. And so if one student doesn't quite get the concept, the other students will help. And so what happens then is that nobody's left behind. And that's important in math, because math builds upon itself. If you don't understand, it's been a while since I've taken math, but say you were taking algebra or something and you didn't understand a key concept, and then 3 weeks later you're not going to understand the new concepts, and you'll get further and further behind. Now, another recent method is the integrative curriculum. It's an approach to education where students and teachers collaborate, and they try to pick a real-world topic to focus on. And so, well, like when my oldest son was in 1st or 2nd grade, they had a unit on the South American rainforest. And so whether it was history or math or science, they were trying to tie that into that particular subject. And it can be useful if you like the subject. It can lead to potential for abuse. Like in upstate New York about 15 years ago, they were having this idea of a unit based on slavery. So everything had to somehow tie into that particular topic. Now, in history, it's easy, but there was a math instructor that gave some math problem like involving whipping slaves and for the optimal production of picking the cotton. So it was like, assume this, this, and this. How many whippings would be the best? He got into trouble for that, of course. But I think there's better math questions about slavery. But anyway, competition to public schools. Private schools are, of course, the main competition, and I'd include for-profit schools under this category. And to some extent, the charter schools. We'll talk about them later, but now in all states, you can go to school online. It's fully accredited, and you can work ahead. For example, you could finish your school year earlier. My youngest son goes to school in I think it's called K-12 New Mexico, or New Mexico Virtual Academy, and so how many of you know someone that went to school online? It's just on the yeah. So private schools, then, the competition, they tend to have higher academic standards, stricter discipline, more homework, and of course, since you have to pay out of pocket, the kids who are going to private schools usually have parents who are able to pay, and so they're often better off. Now, Many people have argued that the government should provide educational vouchers for parents to send their children to private schools. Betsy DeVos, the current education secretary, promotes this idea, and it's actually been tried in a couple of cities and has been found to be effective. And it's not a magic bullet, but in general, let's talk about what a voucher is. Basically, let's say you're a parent and you've got your child in a public school. If you decide to pull him out and put him in the private school, the state or local government reimburses you for that. So pretty much 80-90% of the public schools budget comes from property taxes. So that supports the schools. And the idea here, if you're not using the school, some would argue that you ought to get a refund and be able to put your children in private schools. And it's the idea of competition. That is, for example, if there was only one place to get a hamburger in this town, there'd be less incentive for them to give you a good deal and a good service if there's no competition at all. And so the idea with competition that public schools would be forced or motivated to do a better job. Now, and I said Cleveland and Milwaukee have tried it. Now, critics, though, contend that this free choice in schooling would make public schools a dumping ground for poor people or people who struggled academically, because private schools don't have to accept everybody. Like, I went to a private school for my first 8 years, a religious-based one, and they wouldn't take my brother because he had some eye condition. I can't even pronounce it. It's gotten better now, but he had trouble reading, and so they just wouldn't take kids with special needs. And then if you behaved badly, they just kicked you out. So there's criticism, and also the thought that public schools are a public good. That is, say for example, well, this would be hypothetical, but let's say I have no intention ever of going to North Dakota and driving on their roads. So I'm not going to use it, so should part of my taxes go to support a federal system of transportation? So should I get my money back just because I'm not using it? Or what about this? I rarely go to the library, the Clovis Public Library. So should I get my tax money back for that? I haven't used the police. Well, I called them about 3 years ago for some other thing or a traffic accident. There was a semi-truck that hit took a hard right and hit some traffic signal. But ordinarily, I'm not using the police. So does that mean I shouldn't have to pay for them? Well, obviously, they're a public good, and everybody has to get together and pay for that. And so some would argue that it makes sense to support the public schools through our taxes, even if you don't personally use them. Say you're a couple and you have no children. So you're probably not going to use the public schools, but you still have to support them. But I don't know, what are your thoughts? Should there be a system, you're in a Christian school, should there be a system where, and your parents pay property taxes, so should they get that money back? What do you think? Assuming you're not using the public schools, right?
Yeah, I support the whole, the voucher. But I think the public schools have to be supported by everyone also.
Right.
But I think it's good to produce competition. I think that's going to improve both the private and the public sector.
Yeah. What about the rest of you? Should there be vouchers available to put your child in a private school and have it paid for?
Well, private school is a choice.
Well, it's a choice,
I don't
yeah.
know, that's debatable. 'Cause
That's a
Yeah.
choice. There's always public schools. Private, that's a choice.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, it goes back and forth, and it would be interesting to see with the current Secretary of Education. She's really promoting the school choice idea, and now with Republicans controlling both the House and the Senate and the presidency, we may see some change in this. Now, charter schools are another alternative. They're publicly funded schools operated like private schools, and they're usually chartered by a local school district. So, forgetting the city in New Mexico that sponsors the K-12. But they have more flexibility. They don't have to answer to local school boards, so there's less political influence. I mean, politics sometimes arguably can have a negative influence on the schools. Like in North Carolina a number of years ago, the school board was very religious and wanted to cut back on teaching about biology and evolution and teach more about the Bible. And I mean, regardless of your opinion on that, I mean, if you just say let's learn more about Jesus and less about science, that's debatable. And then on the other hand, in California, there was a school board that was really into the transgender thing, and they wanted to teach their students, have a class about being more tolerant of different people, and they had to cut back on literature or math or something to do that. So there has to be a balance. And charter schools don't have that political pressure. They can use various teaching methods. Many times the school day is longer, or the school year is chopped up. You don't have a large summer vacation. It's more into shorter segments, so you don't have that. What's the word for? There's a word for this when you go. It's like some kids go. Yeah, but some kids, when they have a long summer break, they kind of forget a lot. I mean, you have to kind of bring them back up to speed. Today, the charter schools are often the ones that are online. You have your own teacher, and you can attend Class Connect sessions, and you have a teacher for every class and so forth. Of course, one of the things about online testing, you can always Google it. Well, like my son, he doesn't have proctored tests where you go to with the exception of like the standardized test. What's the PARC? That obviously you have to go somewhere, but you can sit there if you wanted to and just Google the answers. And in fact, one of the interesting things in my online class, I used to have quizzes. I was encouraged by coworkers to do it. And it just, in order to make them cheat-proof, I had to put a time limit on it and make it such that you couldn't just easily open your book and find the answer. And it was too hard. My take on it now, they also have this system now where, forgot the name of it, but you have to, somebody watches you through a webcam.
You proctor?
Yeah, you proctor. Have you had experience with that?
No, I just most of mine are proctored.
Okay, so you just go somewhere physically. You don't. Has anyone had to sit in front of their computer with a e-proctor watching you?
My husband's done that before.
He has.
That's
And
interesting. I've never heard that.
They watch your screen too, so you can't flip over, because sometimes you can tab over to a different internet.
Yeah.
And just Google, but he can't do that when he's being watched, because they watch your screen as well.
Yeah.
So they'll know if you flip over to a different.
Yeah. So my take on the online classes is that I'm going to incorporate the lectures I've recorded, but it's pretty much writing based, and because like I said, giving somebody a test that they can do online just creates a lot of trouble. I consider myself a fairly honest person, but I'd probably be tempted, if I just open a new tab and Google that. Magnet schools, these schools attempt to achieve excellence by specializing in a particular subject area like math or science, and they're often affiliated with a university. Like Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York has a high school where it's more about math or science, but it could be something more geared towards music and theater and art, etc. These are good if you kind of know what you want to do. Most high school students aren't completely sure. I don't know, what percent of 10th and 11th graders know exactly what they want to be when they grow up?
Very small.
Very small, yeah. But if you're sure you're into violins or music or science or technology, then a magnet school might be the way to go. Now, how would you classify what's the military, NIMI, the New Mexico Military Institute? I suppose it might be considered sort of a magnet school because it's more military geared. I don't know, with NIMI, are they all planning to go to the military, or you can just go there and with no intention of joining the military? Anyone familiar with that?
Yeah, you don't have to go into the military.
Yeah, so you can just go to NIMI and go, and it's not required that you sign up for the Air Force or anything. Now, explaining the education with the sociological perspectives, should be 3, not 4 perspectives. First, functionalists would say education is functional and useful. It serves a purpose. It helps to transmit culture. It integrates people socially. It selects and screens talent. So, for example, when I was in university, and it's common today as well, the first 2 years was filled with a lot of busy work. It seemed I was always taking quizzes and writing papers, and when I got to my second 2 years, junior and senior, the work was harder, but your typical class would have like 2 exams and a final project or paper. So we weren't constantly being quizzed, and then they stopped taking attendance. My first 2 years, you get points for showing up. I mean, it's just geared about screening out, because people who aren't serious and aren't devoted, they're going to get screened out. Or even with various popular majors like nursing, they have classes that you have to take and achieve a certain grade to have any hope of getting into the nursing program. Anatomy and physiology is one of those. And funny thing, I never understood this, but back at Lockhaven University, sociology was one of the prereqs for nursing, and you had to get a C in it to have a chance, and realistically, because it's competitive, you probably needed a B. And so back then, I'd have students come to my office and say, you ruined my life. And I said, well, how so? Well, you gave me a C. And I said, well, I just graded the exam and you got a C. But most people are responsible enough to realize it's not the instructor's fault if they got a C. But you do get. It was also English. I had an office mate, Sarah Postduwade. Back, it was kind of odd. We didn't have our own offices, so my office mate was an English professor, and English was also one of the prereqs to get into the nursing program. So she got the sob stories. Of course, she got angry and let them leave. I'm more laid back, and I'll listen to them cry if they want to, but she'd say, "Get out." Sarah was pretty hard-nosed about that. Now, one of the functions is tracking. Students are placed into a curriculum consistent with their expectations for their eventual career. This is more common in Germany, that has like a dual system of high school. There's, forgetting the German name, Gymnasium, I think. But they have a high school that is geared for people who are going on to university. And then they have a high school for those who are going to get some vocational skills and they're going to do more hands-on work. And so they split it up that way. I mean, the benefit is that because you split the high school that way, you've got one group that can be more focused on higher learning and academics, and the other more on woodworking, welding, mechanics, etc. And we also have, to some extent, these alternative schools. My uncle used to teach in one of them. Here it's called choices. Does anyone know, like, how do you get to, how do you get into choices if you want to be there? I think you can request it.
Yeah, I think it's like, some people I know have gone in there because they are distracted easily or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, so now it used to be, I think they were separated, but now the choices is on the actual CHS campus altogether, although they have different. Now, so students placed into a curriculum consistent with their expectations. And there are also some latent functions. Schools function as a daycare center for dual employed couples. You have preschool. I don't know, when I was young, I don't even know if they had preschool, but I started school in first grade. I didn't go, whatever.
Kindergarten.
Yeah, to kindergarten. How many of you went to kindergarten? Yeah. So, yeah, it just wasn't, it might have been available, but not to my parents' knowledge. It's a place, that provides, it's not intended to be daycare, but it serves that purpose, so a latent function. They prevent delinquency by keeping kids busy doing productive things. That's not the primary purpose of schools, but it's a side benefit, so a latent function. And if we're talking about college, they can serve as a place to find one's mate, husband, wife, etc. And I was engaged my senior year, so I never really had this thought, but I knew classmates that they graduated university and they hadn't developed a relationship, and they were worried, I hope it's not too late. Actually, I had some of them sign up for these dating sites because they were so concerned if, I don't know if it's realistic, but some people think if I don't get married by 25 or 26, the chances are like, the longer I go, the older I get now, I'll have fewer options. And it's sort of a desirable thing. I mean, how many of you think you would like to find your partner in a university before you graduate? You prefer that, yeah. So, now, the conflict perspective would point out that school achievement is not completely based on effort and motivation. Students don't all start out equally. I mean, think about this. At what age did you pretty much do your school stuff without having to be told or ordered? Like, you just do your homework and wake up. I mean, for me, well, to be honest, I just never did it because we had social promotions. Like, if I showed up with a positive attitude, sometimes I did. Like, the wrestling coach taught mechanical drafting. I took his class because I liked him, so I did the work because I liked the coach, not because I cared really about it. But those were different days. But if you think about it, my wife and I had foster kids, and their biological mother just didn't get involved and didn't tell them to do things, and they never did anything. And so the point, though, is that if you have parents who are not involved, then the kids are going to get behind. Because, I mean, think about it, maybe you all are different, but at what age did you start doing your work without mom telling you to?
Probably junior high.
Junior high, like 7th grade or something? Yeah. Yeah. So the point is if kids can just do what they want to do, they'll stay up late playing video games and watching TV, and they won't practice their times tables and whatever, and so they'll get behind. So in fact, if you had to draw a pie chart, what % of the student's academic success is due to good teachers and due to good parents, especially early on, like in the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. I think it's more about parents than teachers.
Yeah.
Because, I'm not to say that we don't need good teachers, but if you have a parent that's really involved and hands-on, that's going to be better for the child than just, in other words, if you have a child and the parents are just not involved, it doesn't matter so much how good the teacher is, because they're just not going to do anything. So students don't have an equal starting point, and we as a society increasingly require credentials for various occupations. To be a hairdresser, you need a license, and there's an argument. Robert Sampson has a book called Pathways and Turning Points in Crime, I think is the name. But in that book, he argues that we are increasingly saying that criminals can't do certain jobs, like they can't be a plumber, can't be an electrician, and he challenges that. I mean, obviously, we don't want pedophiles being elementary school teachers, but say you were 18, you got into trouble, with some drugs or something. Should you be able to be a licensed, say, heating and air conditioning repair person? I think, people change. But we require credentials, and in order to obtain the credentials, you have to get an education, which can be costly to afford. I mean, as a matter of fact, if you look at the amount of money that students in upstate New York are paying for tuition at community colleges, it's about 3 times what they would pay if they take classes here. That's why a lot of students are taking our classes from other states. Like, for example, we offer biology with a lab completely online. And so a lot of students who say are living in upstate New York, they're going to pay they pay 3 times as much if they went to their regular school, and so they're taking a lot of classes here. Conflict theorists will be critical of that. The cost of education, and it's going up. The cost of higher education is going up, and it's primarily because the states are paying less into it. You've heard the difference between in-state and out-of-state tuition, right? So if I went to school in Texas, I'd pay out-of-state tuition because I don't live there. It's usually double. And so what that means is, hypothetically throw something out. Let's say that a class costs $600 for out-of-state and $300 for in-state. That means the state itself, the government, is picking up that extra money. And so over time, they're paying less because K-12 is mandatory. You can't just cut the budget of the high school, elementary schools because the Constitution says that. It's a public. But the university, though, that's something that they can be flexible with. Fortunately, in New Mexico, we have the lottery scholarship, but it's running low, and there's been a proposal to increase the GPA, I think, required to be like 2.7. Is it 2.5 now to get your lottery scholarship? 2.5, yeah. You have to have like a C+ average. And so they're running low. And another proposal is instead of covering the tuition 100%, cover it like 97%. Here it's not an issue because our tuition is so low, it'll be covered no whatever the case. But in bigger universities, so I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? If the lottery scholarship is running a bit low, in order to deal with that, should they A, raise the GPA to get it, or B, just cut back on the percentage of funding?
Maybe I should raise the GPA.
Yeah. That way everybody would get the full funding. But then you're going to exclude people who don't get that required GPA. So conflict theorists, though, would be critical of the cost. There's the issue of cultural bias in test as well. Standardized tests can arguably be biased. I'll give you one example. When I was in Michigan at Calvin College, I was teaching there. During the summer, I signed up for this job to grade the MEP test. I think it stands for Michigan Educational Achievement something or other plan or program. Basically, and I was grading 4th grade science. And so we had to, in fact, you had to have a master's degree to get the job, and it paid really well. It was like $30 an hour. So, but anyway, and this was a number of years ago. But anyway, we had a class, and we learned the grading rubric. So one of the questions was something like this. Suppose the city is going to cut down a bunch of the trees in the park. What are some possible environmental effects of doing that? And the correct answers were things like there'd be less habitat for the birds, or there'd be less oxygen. I never quite understood that. I guess that's the idea the trees produce. So there were a number of answers, but I remember I got a pack. They came by schools. You graded by classroom. So I got a pack turned out from an inner city Detroit school, and several of the students said that if you cut down the trees in the city park, there'd be fewer places to hide when there's a drive-by shooting. And so I had to give it a 0 according to the rubric, but I protested because I said, I think this is kind of culturally biased. I mean, that would be an environmental impact. I mean, if people are shooting at you, that's a serious answer, and it was fairly well written and justified. But the point is, though, that some questions can be culturally biased. Take, for example, this question. The following question was asked on an intelligence test. A symphony is to a composer as a book is to what? And the possible answers are paper, sculptor, author, musician, or man. Now, here's how this analogy works. Okay, a symphony is to a composer. So a composer writes or creates a symphony. So the correct analogy is a book and author. But why or how is this question culturally biased? Is like when I grew up in high school, I had no interest in cellos and violins. I liked to watch WWF and Randy Macho Man Savage and Brutus the Barber Beefcake and all these professional wrestlers. And so I mean, I knew in general what a symphony, what a orchestra was. But the point is that what sort of people are more likely to know about cellos and yo-yo ma and violins and whatnot? Music majors, or also kids in more upper class families. And so the question, you're basically, by asking this question, you're giving an advantage to upper class kids who are more involved or perhaps more familiar with a symphony. So cultural bias, one interesting thing in the SAT and even the GREs in the last 15 or 20 years, when there's a story problem involving names of people, you're getting a lot more. It used to be 30 years ago it was Mike and Sarah, but now they'll have names like Masafumi or Yuriko or Javier. Because they don't want to throw a bunch of story problems consistently with names that are associated with white people. Now, if you go back in recent history before the 1960s, Equal education wasn't allowed for many minorities. They couldn't get into certain schools. And this had it has longitudinal effects. That is, even though with the Civil Rights Act, now this is no longer allowed, people today might have had grandparents who lived in a time where they couldn't get into a school just because of their race or ethnicity. Now, in today's society, in America, more money is spent on white pupils than on blacks, and that's because schools are funded primarily by property taxes. And so, like in Albany, New York, I went to SUNY Albany, there was a school where the neighborhood were mostly like a church or something that doesn't pay taxes, and then there were apartments, but the value of the property tax wasn't as high compared to, I mean, just think about this. Has anyone ever been to like a high school in Santa Fe or part of New Mexico that is just, you can tell that they're just rich? I mean, what was one in Albuquerque that had like six soccer fields and multiple tennis courts, and so in other countries this isn't the case. Like in Japan, the public schools are funded by the national government, and they all get about the same amount of money. Whereas here in America, what would be considered in New Mexico a school that's poor? Some small rural schools are this way. I mean, like when I was in high school, there's Nooksack Valley. Their track was just muddy. I mean, they didn't have a nice facilities. So I mean, there's the conflict theorists would be critical of this, and on the other hand, some people say, well, like at Mesa, when my son went there, he got free access to Study Island. It's a website that, and also some other, so basically the school paid for him to get this access, and the facilities were better, and kids at Lockwood didn't get this because their budget was a bit lower. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Should all public schools be given an equitable same budget regardless of where they're at?
I think so.
Yeah. So, and of course, spending money doesn't necessarily guarantee good results. Weird thing in Clovis High School, you usually don't get your own book, your textbook. My wife actually applied for a grant so that her Japanese students could get the actual book and take it home and use it. I don't know, when you were in high school, when I was in high school, I got all my books and I could take, I left them in my locker, but I could take them home if I wanted to. I mean,
You just return them at the end of the year?
yeah, at the end of the year. But there are schools now that they just, for budgetary reasons, they don't have enough money to provide the textbooks. And conflict theorists will be critical of that. Now, another issue is school segregation. It isn't by law, but it occurs due to residential segregation. We don't really have an issue with this in our high school because we have only one high school, well, two if you count the Christian one, but one public high school. But in larger cities, they have multiple high schools, and where you go to school is determined by where you live. And this also affects the real estate values. Like, I remember when we first moved here, we were looking at a home to buy, and they had recently done redistricting, so that this one lady, she was selling her home, she said, they basically moved her out of the Zia school district into some other one, when before she was in the Zia, and it dropped her home value by about $20,000 because parents, when they buy a home, they want to buy into a good school, especially if they have elementary age students. So segregation, schools tend to be segregated, and programs like busing have been found to be effective. This is where you take kids, say, from an inner city school and bring them to the suburban school, or vice versa. Of course, it's highly unpopular the other way. Like, take a kid from a wealthy suburban school and put them on a bus and send them out to an inner city school to encourage diversity and so forth. But I don't know, do you think that should be pursued, the busing programs where you pick out kids from one school and put them in another one that's further away so that there's more ethnic, racial, and economic diversity? It's controversial, though. Now, a solution to some of these problems is compensatory education. This is remedial education. It usually occurs in childhood, like the Head Start program, tutoring, etc., summer schools. But we have it in pretty much all community colleges and some universities have offer remedial courses. Now, obviously, if you're going to Harvard, they don't offer remedial anything. They assume if you get in there, you're good to go. But here, for example, in Clovis Community College, we offer multiple math courses. It used to be you would take this test, the Accuplacer, and if you tested into really low math, like fractions and so on, you could literally spend 6 semesters just trying to get up to the point where you could take Math 101. Now it's self-paced on a computer. Is anyone doing that self-paced math program to get into the 101? Or have you ever? So now you don't have to worry about waiting so long to get into the program. We have remedial English classes, remedial math. Those are the most common ones. There's no remedial psychology or sociology, though. I'm not sure what that would look like. Head Start enjoys the support of both political parties. It's an effective program for helping kids get the knowledge that they need to get started and be successful. Now, the symbolic interaction perspective would talk a lot about how it is that, man, we're way behind here to wrap this up. Anyways, so schools transmit a hidden curriculum to non-academic values, norms, beliefs, and attitudes. It was in school, for example, that I learned to raise my hand. I never had to do that in my family. You learn to wait in line. You learn to get along with other people. I mean, this is sort of the debate about online schooling. If you go to school, K through all your K-12, and it's completely on the computer, is that what do you lose by doing that? The social, yeah. Yeah, of course now, if you're online, you can also participate in sports at the local high school and clubs, I think, as well. So teachers can be part of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They can have positive or negative expectations that can become a reality, especially if children were younger. There was a study actually done a number of years ago where I think it was first grade teachers, it might have been kindergarten, I think it was first grade. They were basically lied to, and they were told that randomly picked kids in their class had scored very high on the Harvard inflected test of intelligence. Now, there is no such test, but back then they didn't have Google, so they teach, and they were said, don't. It's confidential, but we just want you to know that a few of your students in your class are really potentially they're going to be great learners and very brilliant people, and then they followed up, and over the course of 5 or 6 years, these kids who were arbitrarily picked out and labeled as high achievers ended up becoming high achievers. Why do you think that happened? Yeah, they treated them with maybe higher expectations, and kids are more malleable at that age, and so they're more, give you another example. Back when I first started teaching at Calvin College full-time, I was teaching a class somewhat inappropriately. It was I made it too hard. I had assigned readings that was way above the level of most students. But these were freshmen, and so they didn't really know for sure. If I tried that with juniors, I would have got complaints for sure. But the freshmen were kind of like, oh, maybe we have. And I actually had several students who succeeded and went on to graduate school, got their PhDs, because when you throw out high expectations, perhaps even too high, some people are going to be challenged and motivated and succeed in that way. Of course, after that second semester, I decided to have a textbook. But basically, I created my own textbook of photocopied scholarly articles that we went over, and it was, for most of them, too difficult. Now, teachers can promote sexism if they encourage girls, say, to be less talkative, or if a woman is good at math, tell her to be a teacher. If a guy's good, to be an engineer. Microsoft, if you Google it, has this big campaign to increase the percent of women in STEM fields. I think I was looking at the statistic that less than 1% of computer scientists are female in the U.S. And engineers is around 2%. Why do you think that is, that overwhelmingly, if you go to a computer science program, they're all guys? Why do you think? Why aren't there more women in the science and technology fields? Lack of interest, or I think it's perhaps a cultural thing, because in other countries, like in China, there's a higher rate of women pursuing scientific careers. Higher education, college is quite important in our society in terms of income, And as the chart in your book says, for all gender and racial groups, when more education is attained, there's a higher income. But there is a trend now that towards degrees that are marketable and generally result in some sort of a certification or license. Like if you, paralegal studies is one example, social work, education, engineering, the radiology tech, they result in a certificate, and they're very much geared to a specific career. There are degrees that without a graduate program or further education, it's very hard to get a job in that field. So if you have a 4-year degree in psychology, and that's all you have, you may end up working at Starbucks or something, unless you decide to get your master's. On the other hand, there are degrees that, for example, windmill maintenance technology, 2-year degree, starting salary is around $60,000. It's very high demand, and so majors like that are becoming more desirable. The cost is skyrocketing. When I was in college, community college, it was $214 a semester, and then at Washington State University, it was, well, community college was quarterly, and then at the university it was like roughly $800. I mean, and now it's, if you do the research, even with inflation, it's just getting a lot more expensive, and you have to ask yourself, is it worth the loans? I mean, I had a lot of loans, too much, close to $100,000. I paid them all off. But the point is, if you graduate with a degree in, say, cultural studies or sociology, a 4-year degree, and you have a big, big debt, are you going to be able to afford to pay that off? Fortunately, though, here in New Mexico, we have the tuition waivers that I think only Georgia does that as well. So the use of distance education is increasing dramatically. Like it or not, I mean, personally, I prefer a class that's face-to-face ground. And I think students tend to do better in those classes. But right now, when I first started here about 6 years ago, I would teach like 4 classes face-to-face and then maybe 2 online. Now it's completely reversed. I only get 1 ground class because there just isn't that demand for it. And if you look at the numbers, my Intro Soc online has like 70 some students in it. And my ground class, what are we around, 13, 14 or so? And so there's that increasing trend. And I don't know, what are your takes on it? I mean, would you rather have a class in person or online? In person?
In person,
Yeah, I guess it would depend if it were something like a general class that I just needed for my major. I'd prefer in person, but I can understand how it's you can work around the schedule. It's easier to to get other things done. So there's an increasing use of online, and there's some debate about this. Like, would you trust a mechanic who got his degree online? Yeah, I mean, so there are some skills that you want to have a hands-on, you want to demonstrate competency in face-to-face environment. But there's, I mean, my wife took jogging online. She takes classes to keep her license. She has a teaching certificate in several states, and every 5 or 6 years she has to take a few classes. But I remember she took jogging online, and what you did is you jogged, and then you entered the log that, I jogged a mile today. And then my dog, Mr. Snuggles, saw a squirrel or rabbit, and she was jogging with our German Shepherd, and so she got pulled down the sidewalk like 20 feet and got all bruised, and she said, I'm quitting jogging. And so for a while she just, because my dog is 120 pounds and she is 90. Anyway, it was interesting thing though is that nobody checked. I mean, you could take the jogging class and not jog. As long as you said you jogged, you'd be okay. But I don't know, should there be online class? Where do you draw the line on that? I mean, in the limits of, should we have, are there classes or subjects that just really need to be in person?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And then the testing as well. Like the K-12, my son goes there, he has the English literature class, and they let you take the exam like 3 or 4 times and take your highest score, but you can sit there and Google it. In fact, they make the questions so hard, I think, that it sort of discourages this. Like, they ask a question, which of the following best describes the character's mood in this scene? And then, like, one answer is happy and the other one is pleased. You know, the point is they're somewhat synonymous, so you don't know for sure which is the best. At least I don't personally. I mean, I've looked at some of these questions and shook my head, and it's, how is it they think that's right? Because it's the same as the other choice. All right, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there, and I'm going to review now for the quiz. Okay, so first off, the back to basic movement. Why would they encourage standardized testing? Well, the thing here is that they don't know if you've acquired the core skills if you aren't tested on it. So the idea here, since 1987, we just don't assume that you know your math or whatever. You have to prove it in terms of a test to demonstrate competency. Okay, voucher systems. The idea here is in a voucher system, the full cost of private school tuition is paid for by the government. It's controversial, but where they exist, that's what happens. So you put your child in a private school, and you don't have to pay anything for that. A magnet school, that's a school that attempts to achieve excellence by focusing on a particular subject area, like math or science or music, etc. Well, they continue to teach the basic subjects as well. All right, cultural bias in a test. We said that the question about a symphony is it's an analogy question. It's potentially biased because richer kids are more into the symphony. They're more likely to know about that topic than, say, lower class kids. All right, college education, why is it increasing? We said the main thing is state budgetary cutbacks. Because when there's a budgetary crisis and the state has to cut something, higher education is often one of the first things they'll cut because they can't cut K-12. It's constitutionally mandated. I suppose you could cut the police and fire departments, but that's not a popular political thing. It's generally easier just to cut back on funding of higher education and make the students make up the difference when they pay for it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hold on here. Let me pause this or stop the recording.